Hello, Alexa. We're gonna take a look at your aesthetics and control posting here. And so we'll get to share and start taking a look. So again, we just kind of browse through real quick here, see that we're using different lens lengths. Good. Zoom at 35, zooming out. Yep, good. Deep. Looks like you did that one pretty well. Believe it or not, people didn't, not everyone got that one correct. It was a very straightforward, real experimenty kind of one that gives a few people a little bit of trouble. So it looks like you've got everything up there. Now, with these first few, what we're really, of course, trying to look at with to hold is the visual sort of consequence of choosing a shutter speed. What shutter speed is basically the amount of time you're allowing the sensor to be exposed. And while that sensor, the shutter is open, light is pouring through. Now, the light that's pouring through is the light that's reflecting off of the objects. If your camera happens to be moving a little bit, what's happening is the perspective of the camera to the light that's bouncing off the objects changes. And so that's why you get blur, because in one moment, the light might be here where it's bouncing off, and in another moment, it might be here where it's bouncing off. And so if you have this difference here, you'd get a blurry looking image because it'd be part of it here and part of it here. That's why blur happens. Now, depending on how much shake is going on, that will depend on how much blur is happening. So if you've got a long exposure, like a half a second, it's going to be like blur, like a long blur. So you've noticed that. That's the whole point of experimenting with this. It's to discover that and to see how it can be folded into your photography. The 2-second exposures are really where I'm hoping that you find a way to make effective imagery on. And I think you're at least accepting the idea that when you're at that 2-second range, that you're gonna have these exposures. We still have some background stuff that you may or may not be noticing in your shot. When you have that bright light, you probably can't see stuff like this in your frame, but these are the kinds of things we want to pay attention to and try to avoid because they just disrupt and interrupt your composition in ways we don't want. So we'll want to pay close attention to that. I noticed it in a couple of your images. This, whoops, somehow got off on that one. This image is quite nice. It's very has that ethereal kind of feel to it, where you've got this object that is there but not there. That's what we're talking about, being able to use the 2-second exposure rather than just it being blurry. Again, we have this object in the background, which was, just maybe it's not really participating with the composition. We want to just pay attention to those things. But this is a really good use of the effect of multiple, of long exposures. Here you're going for the very fast shutter speed, where you get still some blur going on. Boy, those things must have been really whipping through the air at a thousandth of a second. Those really should have caught. It really should have caught those. I'm wondering if that really was a thousandth of a second, because of something happening 1,000 times in 1 second ought to be pretty close. Not sure why my mouse is bouncing all over the place this morning, but may have mislabeled that one. I don't know. Here, what we have, again, we have this wonderful sort of stretched blur here. You could have even exaggerated more, I think, within the composition. When we're working with these things, sometimes it's difficult to really feel like you're composing because you're making imagery that you can't see. You're having to pre-visualize. You're having to anticipate like what the image is going to look like, not what it actually looks like. And so, I mean, we have an advantage when we're dealing with digital photography because it's so instant. We can immediately see what we've got. And you still have to kind of anticipate where the composition is going to land and then make adjustments when you check it out and trying to figure out whether it's working or not, move your camera another direction. This is one of the reasons why if I'm working with something like long exposures or movement, I'll oftentimes position my camera steady and then I'll concentrate on moving the objects rather than the camera, or the other way around. I'll have the objects very still and I'll just concentrate on moving the camera instead. So either one, that way I'm not trying to do both. I'm holding the camera and the objects are moving. That's going to be real difficult to anticipate your compositions. So now we're going to just kind of move through. You see at a zoom at 35. Let's see, you got to zoom at 35, zoom at 55. At 55, you should be seeing a little bit less able to hold the camera steady. The longer that lens goes, the less forgiveness that you get in terms of holding it. If you have a really wide angle lens, like something that captures a big wide range, it gives you a little bit more freedom to hand hold the camera because it's a little bit easier to keep it steady. Think of it like holding a stick that's really long. If it's a real short stick, it's easier to hold it steady because as you move it here, it doesn't move as much out here. But if you got a real long stick, a little bit of movement here translates to a lot of movement out here. And so that's why when you're zooming, you're basically bringing something far away close. So zooming is like having a long stick. And when you move a little bit over here, it moves a lot over here. I hope that made sense. Maybe it didn't. All right, let's check out your how deep. And now this is, it's really just an experiment. And the idea here is for you to witness the phenomenon of depth of field. And what we should be seeing, if these are placed in the proper order, and it looks like maybe we got them out of order a little bit, because that one looks like we have the most depth of field. Can you see how we go 1, 2, 3, and that one has the most depth of field? Maybe you 1, 2, yeah, it looks like maybe either you had very limited 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22. 22 should be very much in focus here. 16, very interesting. 5, 6, 8, 11, 16. I guess you're not quite getting this foreground in focus. That's interesting. You should be getting that completely in focus, or at least much more in focus than it is at this stage at 22. I suppose it is a little bit more in focus, but it's not really happening for you as much as it usually does. Let's take a look at this other one here. So what should happen here, and it looks like it's happening a little bit more here, but then it kind of goes off a little bit. You can see how looking right here in the foreground, how this is out of focus, that's out of focus. Then it comes a little bit into focus, then back out of focus again. See how it's a little bit in focus there, then out of focus again, then back in focus. Sort of a little bit of strange. Maybe you got that one mixed up a little bit. So what we're doing here is with depth of field is we're studying the phenomenon where you the idea or the visual that you focus on an area, and then with a wide aperture, it's going to allow light to come in and from different areas, different random angles. And those angles mean that the light doesn't have to be as focused to get into the lens, basically. I hope that pairs it down enough. Kind of think of it like more scattered light can come in. It doesn't have to be as sharp, basically. It doesn't have to be as organized. And so when it's not organized like that, the focus will fall off very quickly. So you have your plane of field, and then the focus will fall off very quickly, like a pyramid, a very steep pyramid. Then as you dial down the aperture, the light has to be much more precise to get through there. And so it's more organized. And so therefore the fall off on focus goes a lot smoother, a lot more sort of gradual like that. And what happens is the illusion of focus from that critical point falls off very slowly. And so therefore you should be getting things that are in the background slightly more in focus, things in the foreground slightly more in focus. Now, it does appear that your camera, obviously, your camera is moving around while you're doing this. So that should not have happened. You would have been on a tripod here. Your camera should be just totally steady. All we want to be seeing moving here would be your, would be the focus should be just getting more and more in depth there. But it does look like you got the planes correct, and you are identifying the f-stops well enough. All right, now let's take a look at your exposures, where we're just basically experimenting and exploring all of the possibilities of moving both the aperture and the shutter in a variety of different ways. This is where we're combining, and you're really kind of taking control over the aesthetic view of both shutter speed and aperture, using shallow depth of field versus deep depth of field, using a long shutter speed versus a short shutter speed, using short shutter speed with a deep depth of field, so on and so forth. All these different combinations that you now have a choice to use in whatever combo that you feel like is appropriate, and getting the exposures correct, even though the camera is no longer maintaining the proper exposure for you. So it's also an experiment in developing your eye to be able to notice when things are or are not what you want. So you're having to decide, is this too dark or is this too light? And so that is the idea. And I think you're on the right track here. I mean, the colors are a bit warm, so I think your color balance maybe is slightly off. I mean, they're not so far off that I think they're offensively off, but they seem quite warm here. This is actually quite a lovely image here, where it's a shallow depth of field. You've got a lot of energy going on, multiple layers, shallow depth of field. This one's quite beautiful. So it does look like you successfully managed to navigate through a bunch of, I don't have your shutter speed and aperture combination, so it's hard to tell just exactly what you were working with here, but it does seem like you're making some pretty good choices here. Some of them maybe get a little dark, but outside of just that little bit of luminosity, I think you're on the right track here. Now, here you're doing something. I think there was another student, I'm not recalling who, but it was another student that was working with shooting through objects like this. And it's an interesting strategy to kind of be peering through kind of this voyeuristic thing. It's kind of a good idea. I think maybe if we opened up a little bit more, meaning gotten closer to that aperture, that hole, so that less of it is there. But I think I remember this double one looks kind of cool too. This is really interesting, because there you get a little bit more right in here. You get a little bit more tone going on. And so you have a repetition, especially since you have the repetition of this circle plus this circle. That's really, really quite beautiful. But then you start doing this, which is kind of an interesting idea. And when I see something like this, it tells me that you're exploring, you're kind of trying to figure out some stuff. And at this point, it looks like you maybe figured out, like, hey, wait, what if I kind of come off of that a little bit? What if I, instead of shooting directly through the hole, what if I kind of come off of that and just use the blurry edge of it and try to work in through the composition? And so you started to try to work with that, and then you shifted the color balance. Although those are pretty much the same image, which one would you choose? That's what I would ask you to do when you have images that are three of them this close together. I would say, look at all three and decide which one is the most effective. Which one would I choose? I would say I pare it down to these two in terms of my own sort of visually looking at how they're working or not working. This one feels like it was like a discovery, like, oh, look what I can do. And then you kind of worked it out a little bit better, and then you shifted the color a little bit more. But which one is the more closely aligned to what you're interested in showing us? This one's, again, pretty interesting juxtaposition. You miss it just a little bit here. I think if this overlapped a little bit right here or didn't overlap, that they would be a better sort of tension and energy right in here. I think you're doing a really kind of interesting job here. There's definitely some explorations. These projects aren't meant to make you like a master at certain things. What they are really more about is introducing you to some concepts and then getting you to explore them. So I'm not looking for like everything to be like knockout, like amazing kind of stuff. What I'm looking for is it's the exploration, is that you are making every attempt to explore the topics. Now, this next one, the sunlight as key, it's kind of like an intermediary project where we took a week and had you guys go out and do the use the sun as your key light in teams. To prepare you basically for the following the sun project as you're working on. So here, what I'm basically looking at is how you're adapting the things that we're learning in the studio to something that you can't control, which is the sun, and how you're able to use the same tools to modify what you're seeing and be able to turn something that is sometimes unusable, like direct sunlight, into something that you might be able to control a little bit more. And this is quite good in terms of controlling the light. You've managed to use the direct sunlight, but at the same time, it seems like you found an area where it's not so overwhelming to that the shadows aren't kind of getting too deep on you. It's very patternistic, and the color is quite beautiful. Maybe if we got a little bit closer, or we're maybe looking at more of the shapes or more of the textures, it could have popped a little bit more. But just in terms of finding the area, this one's a little bit less great, because it has more of that just kind of blasted with that frontal broad light that we're talking about. This has, even though it is broad light, is kind of coming from the side there, because you have the diffused light mostly going on in the back here with these subtle kind of shadows that are happening. That's adding some variation and adding some tonal texture to what's going on. Here, it's just like kind of like a spotlight aiming down on the thing, and it's much less variety going on than something like this. So the difference between something like this and like this, I think, is extremely apparent, and it has to do with the modulation of the light, not just that there's light. This is quite lovely and beautiful. Even a more shallow depth of field would have helped to get this background even more out of focus, so that it's almost like just a haze back there. It would have really made it interesting. Here you're using more of shape-based stuff that is, I think, helping you out. There you backed up a little bit, and so we're losing some of that shape-based quality. And again, we've got just, rather than the beautiful modulations that are happening here, it's more about the broad lighting that's just sort of shining right on here. So hopefully you can see the differences between this and this visually, and how it communicates something completely different. This feels much more just observational, like, hey, here's some leaves. And this seems much more like, what is she trying to communicate? Or, whose perspective is this? Like, whose eyes are we seeing through? So there's a big difference there. This is a kind of an interesting play on using the shadows as an element of the composition. Very good, where we're using the shape here to sort of slice up the composition, and then using the leaves themselves to break up that shape. Excellent stuff here. Let's kind of move to this next one where you're again doing the same thing. We got a little bit off over here compositionally. In other words, the composition feels a little bit off balance because this is shifted over so far. Perhaps, I know you were maybe trying to get this in there, at least it looks like that's what you're trying to do, balance that crack in there with the other part, but I think you went over a little bit too far. If we moved it over, in other words, kind of honored the rule of thirds kind of thing, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. We go over that in our expressive composition class, but the rule of thirds would have placed the center of this area somewhere right over here. So just a little bit farther over would have happened, which might have meant that this gets pushed over here, which might have meant that you had to back up in order to get it in there, to put that at another third, and so on and so forth. There's this navigation that you kind of want to do when you're working with these patterns to get it to sort of fine tune. It's like tuning an instrument sometimes. You're trying to just find the right chord to make it happen. And it kind of missed it a little bit there. As opposed to this one, which does kind of work in the ways that we're looking at. All right, here's the window light, which it should be, relatively soft, which it is, much more sort of about how you're dealing with the soft light and whether you're able to reflect light back into it, all of those kinds of things. Now, it appears to me that you went ahead and you kind of put together a composition. You got some objects and you kind of laid them together. And that is a difficult thing to do in photography. I think, probably the one that works the best of them is this one, because you started to explore the composition with the camera. This one is more observational. Again, you're kind of just taking a picture of the objects. You lay them out in a way that's sort of already a composition. And then you kind of explored that and found this other composition within that. That's what photography is, finding compositions within things that are already there. That's not to say that you can't construct that, meaning add objects, kind of place them in front of the camera. But photography at its heart is a reductive process. So that means that you always start with everything, the whole world. And then as soon as you grab the camera and you start looking through the viewfinder of the camera, you've now erased everything else and only have what the camera's pointed at. So now you've reduced everything, and now what you have is what the camera's pointed at. If what the camera's pointed at is nothing, it's basically a blank table, like just a table with nothing on it, and you start adding things to it, that is actually psychologically, I think, contrary to how photography works, because photography is about reducing things down to its bare elements, finding things within that, as opposed to adding things until it's complete. Adding things to complete is the process of drawing. You make marks and you continue to make marks until you have added enough to complete the drawing. But photography is about moving around and adjusting and making things in focus or out of focus until you have found a complete composition. So backing all the way back up, I'm not discouraging people or saying you shouldn't be making compositions where you put things together like this. That's good to do that, but then do this, explore them all around, because then you're going to find that photography yields images out of compositions. It's much better to sort of find compositions out of things that are there. That's more closely aligned to the process of photography than having something blank and then trying to just arrange things. You'll find the other way to be a much better, or maybe a much more natural way to deal with photography. So that's what I have for you. I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to seeing more of your images, and we'll see you in class. All right, bye now.